So we're going to talk about the dark side of machine-driven media. There's been a lot of discussion already about this topic to some extent. It seems to have been threaded through some of the conversations we've had today. From the outset, with the questions around automation and the questions around the impact on society of this machine-driven ecosystem, the conversation around platforms, the relationship between publishers and platforms, the conversation that we just had to some extent, the conversation around bots, all of those. We talked about some of the side effects, the externalities of machine-driven media. And I'm excited that we're going to finish the day on this one. And I'm also very pleased that it's followed by drinks, because I think we're going to need one after this discussion. We're going to make time for some questions during this, because there's some awesome people in the audience. I want to make sure you all get an opportunity to ask questions on this topic. So please prepare your questions now, and please tweet the hell out of this conversation, because I think it's an important one to have. And so I'm going to welcome my co-panelists onto the stage now, in no particular order. Jason Kent, who is the CEO of Digital Content Next. Hopefully, again, they hear us and know it's time to come out. We've had this problem where we need a hook or something like that. Is the panel ready? Come on out, guys. Hey, Jason. Okay, Jason's just come from DCN's board meeting, so he's going to join us. Next up, we've got Jared Sandberg, who's Senior Executive Editor here at Bloomberg. We've got Monica Jejajowska, who is Privacy Counsel at Hearst. Hope I got that right. Close enough. She'll correct me. And finally, Mark Hansen, who is Director of the Brown Institute for Media Innovation at Columbia University. So welcome, everybody. By way of introduction, I'll let you all maybe answer the easiest question, a yes or no, or maybe a binary question, and then tell us exactly what it is that you do with relation to this topic today. But are you optimistic or pessimistic, and who are you, Jason?
I'm optimistic because it's the end of the day and we're headed into drinks. I run a trade association, DCN. Our membership, the way you should think of us, is we're the premium publishers for digital. So we have about 80 members, but we cover all of the historical verticals in terms of our membership. So we have like 25 pure plays, Refinery, and Vox, but then we also have all the magazine brands, television brands, and newspaper brands, and we're figuring out the future for them, and we're their trade association.
Monica.
I'm optimistic. I'm the counsel for privacy and cybersecurity at Hearst. Hearst is one of the largest media and information companies. And as a lawyer, I have to start with a legal disclaimer that the views that I'm going to express today are my own views and not the views of my employer.
I have that on my Twitter profile, by the way. Yeah.
It's funny because I am a pessimist by nature. I don't see much percentage in optimism. I don't like to be unpleasantly surprised, but I am optimistic about these issues. We've seen them all in some way, shape, or form before, and we've tackled them and we've been successful. And so I think we'll do the same.
And what do you do here at Bloomberg?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Senior Executive Editor at Bloomberg Digital, so the consumer-facing website.
Mark Hansen.
I'm a hopeful man, so I'm optimistic. I am a professor at Columbia. I lead something called the Brown Institute. It was founded, well, we're 5 years old now. It's located half at Stanford Engineering, hi Lev, half at Stanford Engineering and half at Columbia Journalism, and it's about exploring the interplay between technology and story.
So, and you are going to have to leave here and go and teach. What's the class that you're teaching this evening?
I'm teaching a class called Computational Propaganda.
Why are you training computational propaganda?
See, that is the headline my dean specifically did not want. So that's not the headline. The headline is that we're teaching our students, teaching the journalists about well, primarily about computation and its role in society, how algorithms, how code governs the way the world around us functions. And given the events of the recent election, we decided to spin the class in a particular direction that let us talk about all these themes, but at the same time help students perhaps report a little bit better on some of the topics that I think you want to discuss today.
So this morning, John Borthwick used the election when he was talking about these externalities that we're seeing emerge from our use of social media, of machine-generated media, of vast troll armies that are directed by foreign governments or outside interests. And he sort of suggested that the election was a kind of turning point for people in realizing what's really going on here, and that perhaps some of these inventions like social media haven't necessarily been entirely for the good, haven't brought us closer together. What about this media ecosystem makes it so ripe for disinformation and for fake news and for these externalities to rear their head?
It's the pace of innovation increasing, and then the automation element of it. And it's funny you bring up John Borthwick. When I took on this role 3 years ago, it was on this theory that between kind of the three main stakeholders in digital industry, publishers, consumers, probably the most important, and the advertisers that subsidize a lot of the content, that you had more and more automation happening between those stakeholders. And the trust and value exchange between those three stakeholders is what makes our industry thrive. And that you're going to have more and more disruption there. And it was going to take a reset on what the trust principles really are. We weren't even thinking about fake news at the time, but we had a panel, a discussion specifically on this issue, and John was on the panel. I'd love to go back and see what he said 3 years ago. But certainly things are much worse than they were 3 years ago.
Why?
Why? Because there's new ways in which automation is accelerating, and there's less accountability by the principles that are making money off of it than I think ever before.
So describe this triangle. Describe what you think of as this ecosystem for those in the room.
You got the audience, the most important. You've got the advertisers who interact with the audience through their ad experiences. So right now you've got the largest boycott that's ever happened in terms of advertising, right? They're installing ad blockers because the experiences are so bad. And then you've got the publishers, which is where the people actually create and facilitate the content and news and entertainment the consumer actually wants. And they're in this kind of vicious cycle where the economics aren't working out. They're trying to find more efficient ways to survive in a disintermediated world. And you've got two companies that are taking almost 100% of the industry's growth, the platforms. So I'm still optimistic. But carry on to our other friends over here.
But it's a circumstance that will, yeah. So Monica, you're dealing with these questions from cybersecurity from a privacy perspective. How in Jason's triangle of terror there, how does personal data sort of fit into all of this, and why is it important?
Sure. Well, I think another way of describing what you just said is everybody's fighting for the consumer's attention, right? And how do you get people's attention? You can get it by what you know about them. What do you know about them? It's what information you have collected, right? And I think what we've seen through the past few years is that this whole notion of personal information has just exploded, right? Especially in the U.S., where we don't have one comprehensive privacy law. We have a patchwork of law depending on what sector you're in, what do you do. You may be subject to different laws. There's not one definition of personal information out there. We can't even agree how we call personal information, right? Is it personally identifiable information? Is it personal data? There's this concept of anonymous data. Is any data really anonymous when you can potentially tie it back to a user? You have the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, which is one of the primary regulators in the U.S. from the consumer perspective, who's been in its settlements taking even a more aggressive approach, and they came up with a concept of covered information, which really covers, any information that can be used to identify an individual, a computer, or a device, right? So we have this ever-expanding notion of data. I think we have this issue also of, is all data equal? Because when the privacy laws were originally passed, especially the state breach laws here, it was to, protect consumers from identity theft or some credit card fraud, right? So the laws were meant to protect information like your social security number, your credit card. Is that the same as knowing how much time you spend every day reading articles, right? But of course you have to push that analysis further because it's very subjective. And it's one thing if I go on the NewYorkTimes.com every day versus I looked up, a medical condition, and then suddenly I start seeing ads for a healthcare clinic or something like that, right? And maybe it's not my medical condition, it's my parent who's sick, and I did some research. So from a publishing perspective and the advertisers to them, The other issue is, how's that data collected? And are consumers aware when the collection happens? Is it all transparent, right? And we get into the issue of the privacy notice and the disclosures, and regulators coming down with more guidances and laws saying, you have to be more transparent, clearer in time notices, right? But are we getting to a point where you won't be able to access any website without having to click on 15 things? I agree to this, I agree to that. Does anybody read this? Does anybody understand that, right? And the last issue there is it's choices. What choices should consumers have, right? Can I totally opt out of all that collection? But this brings us to what you were mentioning about ad blockers. Of course, from a publishing side, the big question out there is, can you make your content subject to people not installing ad blockers, right? What's the alternative to that? You have to make people pay for your content. So it's not an easy answer, right? Because
I just think it's interesting because, as Jason pointed out, we have people exploiting technology, which they've done before. I don't think many people here wake up every morning to see Nigerian spammers, erectile dysfunction ads, and all the rest. That was a situation that was co-opted by people who were trying to scam other people, and we kind of fixed that problem, right? Now we have people exploiting the personal data, and the one thing that I think, just to add to this very nasty concoction that we have, is that you're exploiting personal data because you now know who to really piss off and mobilize in an election, right? And the audience here, this is where you have to start to bring in all kinds of, not only are the companies getting disintermediated, but so are people. We have automation taking people's jobs, we have, income inequality, creating, I think, this sort of very volatile this volatile mix that allows politics to appeal to anger and technology and the exploitation of personal data to really piss people off. And I think we saw that in this election, where we saw people using everything at their disposal to mobilize what arguably was 80,000 people who might have made the difference in 3 swing states, and they were able to micro-target just that group of people, if you believe the reporting around, what happened with the election. So we're probably still not done adding to what was at play here, and I'm sure you might.
So let's pick up that just for a second, because and Mark, maybe you can help us out with this a little bit too. But a lot of people, I think that's where their fear comes from right now. They're thinking about, they've read some articles about firms like Cambridge Analytica. They've heard a little bit about Facebook micro-targeting. They've read maybe that they shouldn't have done that Facebook quiz because it might have given someone behavioral targeting data that's now being used to peel them off from or suppress their vote. They kind of imagine to themselves, I can think about all the technologies that I saw at the Machines Plus Media Conference today, and I can imagine 10 years from now that we're in this perfect storm of personal data, computationally produced and generated media being combined, and we just live in this dystopian world of completely unreal, figments that are produced by machines to propagandize us. That's the fear, right? That's the Black Mirror kind of fantasy. Mark, is that what you see happening in the future?
I was wondering where there was a question there. Phew.
I told you I was going to have a catharsis on the stage.
You were, and I wanted to have a space
let
where
it
you can
let
let
it
that
happen.
out, right?
Let it out.
It's been on your mind for a while. Look, I go back to where I started. I'm a hopeful man, right? And I believe that if we can unpack some of these terms, unpack some of this technology, help. I'm in a journalism school, so the action that I can take in the world is to help journalists report on things more responsibly, understand more about. So our class gets into the nitty-gritty of how recommender systems works, gets into the mathematics of it. And for the most part, it's geometry, and we all love geometry in elementary school. Give students the tools to report on, report with. And now, I think with the rise of the platforms and various kinds of effects that are taking place, report sort of through the media that they're or these tools rather that are at their disposal. I think that in the class we've surfaced a lot of things that by taking certain concepts seriously, like can we use machine learning to detect fake news, right? So that was a big buzz for a while. Well, is that really possible, and how hard is that problem really? And even if you look at the fake news challenge now, it's backed off from here's an article, can you tell it's fake or not, to here's an article, can you write some code that'll decide if the headline matches
This is the
claims
project
in the
at
body.
Carnegie Mellon.
Right. And so the idea is to try to kind of unpack some of these things to both demystify as well as provide tools for journalists to imagine a world, or others to imagine a world where things function differently. Right. That's part of that's part of the purpose of a kind of computational teaching computational. Right. There are a few kinds of literacy you can talk about. There's sort of functional literacy, like how does it work? So we teach someone how to code. There's critical literacy, why does it look the way it does, and could it look differently? And then there's rhetorical literacy, the idea that it's all of these systems are the result of some kind of deliberation. They're a possibly compromised solution, and they have powerful rhtorical, or they have rhetorical power in the world. So I think this is a very rambling answer to your question, but I think I'm hopeful in the sense that as K through 12 gets better at teaching about computation and teaching about the world around us through computation, and that we'll be more sort of critical consumers, right, of the kinds of computational infrastructures that deliver media to us.
So I'll just push on this point for just a moment, if you all will allow me. We know that while you're working hard to train up journalists to be able to be skeptical and to be able to understand these methods that are being, to some extent, used against fact or used against reality, we know we've got foreign governments that are standing up new information warfare divisions. We know we've got, what was the number? The Chinese are doing somewhere around 500 million fake social media posts a year just to sort of dilute public opinion. We're seeing just enormous forces essentially using our commercial media and social media infrastructure kind of against us in a way. And then we've got this problem of trust between advertisers and publishers and people. Can we keep up? Are we going to be able to really, address these problems in the current environment?
We're all optimists.
You're all optimists. You believe we can.
I think there's a great article by Dana Boyd a few weeks ago, I think, about is it really up to the media and tech companies to solve this issue of fake news? Because I think one thing we've left out a little bit of the conversation too is consumers and readers. What role do they play in that, right? Because clearly everybody's attracted to the very sensational news or the things that may be most likely fake news or misinformation or however you want to call it. I don't know that we even agree on what fake news always is. And so I think, this goes very hand in hand with privacy and what information can companies get for what purposes, because there's often a bit of a, shocking factor from the consumer. Well, I had no idea this was happening. But do you really think, everything's available to you for free? It's not, right? That this is the trade-off. We get some data about your interactions so that we provide you content. Content will feature ads that we think are of interest to you. Have we gone too far with how tailored it is?
Sorry, go ahead.
I think these are all accountability issues, and on the advertising side and privacy side, what we see is that there's a distinct difference between a direct relationship, first-party relationship, we call it, and a third-party relationship, an indirect relationship. And as long as you're using that data inside the expectations of your consumer, and they have an ability to differentiate between that and some other third party that's outside their expectations collecting using data, that's a significant difference in the trust barometer you can set. Just like in the offline world, if you walk in Target and if they're collecting data and doing different things, you could choose not to walk in Target. You can choose not to use the New York Times website. You can show choice through your actions. The same issue exists too on the fake news front, in my regard. And all due respect to this point that the consumer, I agree. Consumer needs to understand it better. The platforms need to take some accountability. They have been naive or willfully, ignorant to this issue, and even if it's just a 1 or 2% or whatever it is of the material, and the consumer should be smarter about it. It's the Flint Water Department, and they need to make sure that pollution's cleared out because it affects the entire ecosystem. And we have a set of policies in this country that allows them to be hands-off or solve it entirely with machines. So if Facebook's got $10 billion a year profit, I'd like to see a little bit of that money go back towards whatever it takes to actually clean it out in a stronger way. And I don't think the response has been anywhere close to the moonshots that they celebrate in other regards. One other thing that's concerning about that piece is because you brought up the Cernovich Rice story is something I got completely missed. 24 hours before that, there was a Wall Street Journal reporter who had reported on something about Google and YouTube, and a user on YouTube, very popular user, put up a video clip saying that the Wall Street Journal made the entire story up. It was proven inaccurate very quickly by the internet community. But over the next 24 hours, and I'd say really the next week, that Wall Street Journal reporter was attacked. Like I've never seen attacked on Twitter. People saying he should just die. And it was a hateful attack, and there was never really any accountability for it. Mike Cernovich started with a tweet a lot of that volume towards this reporter. And it got totally lost because everybody moved on to the Susan Rice story.
Right.
And it was fascinating to watch. I think Daily Beast was the only publication that covered it.
Well, he's been an interesting fulcrum because we've seen, we've seen the Syria hoax hashtag as well, which started with Russian trolls that then Cernovich picked up and promoted, which then became, a trending tag on Twitter and became a very popular line of thinking among certain elements.
And the verified label icon makes it feel like an authoritative person, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's interesting.
So I mean, that's a good example of how information just gets laundered, from one place to another, and one of the reasons that
and the systems of trust that we've established
Absolutely.
that it's a little bit and a little bit and a little bit,
That's
and
right.
then suddenly you're over here, right?
Yeah.
And
I think,
Go ahead.
whenever, maybe these are not great examples, but whenever you're relying on technology, then you get into the cybersecurity issues, right? Because any technology could be hacked, manipulated. You don't know who's behind it, who suddenly started being used it's being used some different ways, right? And that's something.
Are there any examples of that you've seen lately that come to mind?
Nothing on top of my head that I would discuss.
We'll come back to it. So I want to pick up on that. We're going to take your questions as well in just a moment, so please do prepare those. I want to come back to you all were talking about privacy and privacy law, and how privacy is really a fulcrum, for this, because in that possibly crazy dystopian vision of the future that I laid out, where personal data is being married with this capability to produce lots of personalized media, that seems pretty scary. What reason do we have to be optimistic that our personal data is going to be protected? I mean, right now we're seeing personal data seemingly leak all over the place. We read last week that our headphones are listening to us. We'll probably read tomorrow that our juicer is listening to us. Why should we be optimistic that our personal data will be protected? Who in the government's doing something about that? Jason.
Sure, I'll jump in first. No one in our government. They just
that's sad.
They just dropped our privacy rules we worked on for a year as an industry, and claimed it was a last-minute midnight Obama thing. But we worked on it for a year, and they just threw them out. So, and that's complicated issue. So we're not going to dive into that. Europe is interesting. We got real regulation, spring of 2018, GDPR. That some have called the gold standard for everyone else in the world except for the United States. So we're kind of going in two different directions. It'll be interesting to pay attention to how that rolls out. It has up to, I think, 4% penalties, 4% of total revenues. So it's got real teeth to it. Assuming the EU is still around,
still intact. The French election matters for a lot of reasons.
Anyway, I think I'd look to Europe on a lot of issues right now.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else on this topic, Monica?
I think, the European and pretty much the rest of the world approach to privacy is slightly different than the U.S. in part because there is a comprehensive data law. It goes back to history, it's history of government spying on people, but it's also part of the reason why a lot of these tech companies were not born in Europe, because to do what they wanted to do, use the data in the ways they are using it, commercializing it, it's not something you could really do in Europe, or you would have to go through a lot of hurdles to get there. So I don't know that that is the gold standard either. I think it's kind of a happy medium. And to your question of, who's in charge of protecting the data, I mean, it goes back to a question of trust, right? As a company, be it the publishing side, if we want to be able to provide content that's appealing to readers and that they're going to come back and keep read or watch whatever we have, right, we need to have some sort of ongoing relationship with them. But we need to know a little bit about them to make sure that whatever we're putting out there is desirable. This is what's, people are interested in. But then, yes, it's on us too that whatever data we get, we use it in the ways we told people we would. We make sure we store it, if it's in the cloud, that we use reputable cloud providers, that we don't let any third parties, because a lot, to go back to what you were saying earlier, this advertising system gets very complicated because you end up working through networks and other third parties, just technology vendors too, that help you do analytics on the different information you have. And at some point, it's a little bit hard knowing who's who in the chain and what is it exactly that they do, right? So that's, I think, on all companies who get any data to make sure you have a good understanding and you sort of take measures to protect, and maybe don't keep the data forever too, because that's, another problem.
Mark or Jed, anything from you on this issue of privacy and who we should be looking to someone to demand someone protect us?
I have almost nothing interesting or valuable to say on this subject except from a very narrow perspective. Journalists, and I think that this is true for people here and for people at a huge number of publishers, their only currency is credibility, right? And credibility is built through transparency, and Jason talks about trust, and it's all part of the same family of operating above board and being super honest with your reader and all the rest. It takes decades to build that, and it takes one bad moment to blow it. And so I think that the world, I think that people generally hate the media, right? And so we know that. I think if people knew how much we sweat the small stuff, they might feel better. And so, I do wonder if the industry is thinking about sort of, in some ways, opening the kimono to allow some of these processes to be observed, because I do think people would think a little differently about, the media in general and the level of care that often goes into stuff. I mean, there are people right downstairs right now who are freaking out about whether they can use a verb that sounds just slightly more aggressive than another verb, and that's what's going on in here and in a million other places, and even amongst individuals. We know, for example, that those people, influencers on social networks, we tend to follow those people who are really cautious, careful, and even-handed about how they're gathering and trafficking in information. So I don't really want to be naive about all of this, but I do think that there are forces that are actually very operative and powerful that are endorsing the credible sources, and my hope is that we don't inadvertently do things. This gets back to a platform argument. It's not a privacy discussion. To disintermediate, where we need the platforms to allow those brands to be a little bit more obvious to people, whether it's a personal brand of some guy who's really fabulous on a given subject, or whether it's a media brand. As far as personal data, we don't actually collect any personal data on the web. We're going to. And we're going to do it in a way that is so, God, if this were a teenager, asking a girl on a date, you'd feel bad for him because he's barely asking at all. I mean, it's going to be so sort of like tortured, and we're barely going to be asking for anything. And I think we're in a position where we want to know more because, like everyone else, we want to drive engagement and serve our readers with stuff that's more relevant to them. If we run a JPM earnings headline, most of the world couldn't care less about what JP Morgan earned the last quarter. But for those people who have skin in the game and who own the stock or care about banking for one reason or another, it would be nice for us to know that so that we could tell them what they want to know. I think as long as you're really transparent, transparency tends to be, sunlight tends to be one of the best ways to go about this. And as long as we're, even if we have the best intentions, if we're storing it in a cloud provider that gets hacked, then suddenly that's that bad moment I was talking about. So I think I do think that most of our competitors and big and small, startups and all the rest, actually care a lot more about this than people know. And as long as they, it's funny because you think of our founders talked about a more perfect union. In other words, perfection was never really possible. You always have to work towards perfection. You'll never quite get there. I think the same is true with journalism. So it speaks to the vigilance that we all need and is required of us in order to maintain the trust that, like I said, takes decades to sort of build up. So it's not really an answer to the privacy question, but these are important principles around privacy that have to govern it. Otherwise, we're going to blow it.
If I could add just something, when you think of privacy and really what are the risks when something goes wrong, there's really 4 big risks. One, you're going to have regulators coming knocking on your door and asking you to explain what is it that you're doing and, potentially imposing fines on you because you breached some laws. Right. You're going to have consumers potentially coming after you and suing you. These first 2, you can have a good sense of how much it's going to cost you. Third effect would be the reputational risk, what you just said, and that can be massive, and sometimes you can't put dollar amounts on that, right? But the fourth risk is if you don't engage in some of these practices, if you don't monetize your data, you may be out of business very soon, right? Because somebody else is going to do it. So it's a bit of a competitive advantage too.
Right, and 2 companies are able to do that across most of the web. I mean, the top 10 data collectors across the web are Google and Facebook, and now we just allow the ISPs into that game. And so for companies that can see much of the web traffic, URL, they have a distinct advantage that an individual publisher will never have. And so the economics are never work in their favor, so there's economic harm too. I think the direction we've taken in the last year is very troubling. I mean, the most sensitive thing we have, if I grab Justin's phone here, it makes you more uncomfortable than if I grabbed your wallet, right? So, right? And now, Verizon or whoever is able to know where that phone is and know what you're doing on that phone.
Right.
It makes me concerned. Are you okay?
Our phone's listening.
Are you okay?
Yeah. Mark, you're kind of looking concerned over there.
That's my resting face.
Yeah.
I'm a faculty member. That's what we do. No, I think also there's maybe something that a role for organizations like yours can play in the sense that when startups are first starting up, there's a tremendous temptation to collect everything you possibly can in that moment. The system is designed to just pull down everything you can because you can. You don't know if you're going to need it later. Perhaps there's a kind of parsimony principle around system design that means you request only what you need for the job at hand. This is extremely naive, but it feels like that kind of value could be something that you would instill in startups.
Okay, I want to open up to questions from the audience. I know we've got a couple of mics coming around. We are recording this, so make sure you do get to talk into the mic. But who has a question for this panel on the dark side of machine-driven media? I know I've got one right here in the front from Lev Management. Here comes the microphone.
I was going to leave, but it was a great panel. So when I look at the title, The Dark Side of Machine-Driven Media, so let's say we can fix the small problem, which is fake news. How do we fix the big problem, which is the news itself, right? Meaning, right, there is like science news, there is political news, and then there is what the rest of the world, right, watches and reads, which is celebrity, life, divorces, killings, right, in some different part of the world, which, to be moralistic, I would say people really don't need, right? And I think when 19th century people went to churches, I think maybe the world was a better place. So, right, so we have to think about the whole institution of news, how it develops in the West and kind of 18th century, how the sensationalism was always part of it, 19th century as well, yellow press. And I wonder, right, since we have all these amazing tools and these incredibly smart people, can we actually use machines to like somehow, make the news better, right? So the news are more knowledge, or let's say good knowledge, as opposed to just feeding on this kind of sincere, kind of animal nature in us, right? Who wants to read these things which are really, maybe not relevant to humanity.
So
progress.
when the artificial
Can
intelligence...
can algorithm like start feeding people like science news? I'm kidding, but I'm not kidding. But yeah.
Just that when the artificial intelligence has taken all of our jobs and all we've got to do is sit around and consume media, my mic has died, I guess, and all we've got to do is sit around and consume media. Not to make too many value judgments, but how do we educate the masses? I guess is your question to some extent.
Or maybe trick them into consuming like useful stuff.
Right. Is anybody working on that sort of thing at Brown, Mark?
Oh gosh. Right. So, look, I teach in a journalism school. We teach our students to hold power to account, right? To do the real work. So, to the extent that machine learning or something like that can be a partner in that exercise because of the scale of the question that's being asked, the ways in which some phenomenon in the world manifests itself, then all the better, right? We'll teach them to probe the world in those ways. So I don't quite know how to answer your question, except we're doing an awesome job of training the next generation.
So it seems like
Sorry, Beth, go ahead.
It seems like the reverse of that question was, how close are we to idiocracy? Although that's not my actual question. My question is for any of the panel members, what is the most egregious example of illegality or just blatant lack of ethics that you've seen in the last year?
With regard to media and personal data?
Media and personal data.
Jason, that's a good one for you.
The most egregious?
The most egregious.
By a company or just looking for something scandalous? By a company. I'm going to call it a company.
Or an entity with an agenda. There's so many to choose from.
Yeah, I wasn't expecting that one. I don't know how in the last year you don't see certain things that happen around the election. I mean, where you have, literally people popping up farms of websites, both pro-Trump, anti-Trump, pro whatever side, just to literally move
30 million Facebook users' data stolen and essentially sold to the Trump
more
campaign.
Recently, but if you want me to throw shots at various things, it bothers me that Facebook announced on Good Friday, which I've been in the media industry for 20 years. You announce stuff on Friday when you don't want people paying attention. And Good Friday, you really do it. And so to hold something for a couple weeks and announce on a Good Friday that they've eliminated a bunch of fake accounts without any actual transparency to how many accounts, how many fake likes were driven by that. This happened just a few weeks ago. And the media completely missed it. And they put up a little blog post, as they do, and said, we got rid of a bunch of fake accounts. It was a spam operation. That's basically what they said. I expect a level of leadership from a company that's making more money than the collective media combined, and transparency that we're not seeing, and so that's fairly egregious. All right.
Anybody else? Monica? Anything egregious that you've seen? Nothing to share.
Good pass on that one.
Jed, anybody?
I actually don't. I'm not going to cite a company. I think it's interesting. When I talked about media in America isn't really admired, and I understand that, and I think we should have our feet held to the fire. But at least we issue a correction. Yep. When was the last time you heard a politician issue a correction? Wouldn't it be cool if the marketplace demanded that in a more sort of overt way? Now, this is, politicians have been doing this for decades, so I don't really want to, again, be naive about all of this. But I do think that the media industry tries to correct itself and tries to police the truth much better than politics ever would. And it does feel to me that there was something different about this election in which, you can't hold up, let's just go back to the beginning, you cannot hold up inauguration crowd sizes and ask the world not to believe what it's seeing with their own eyes, provably, demonstrably false things. And so, my hope is that we demand as an electorate, citizens, we demand better not only of the media.
Well, you all just launched a site on climate, for instance.
Well, we did. So we launched the site climatechanged.com. Not because we don't see our rivals doing smart, informed coverage, but after a while, we're in the habit at Bloomberg being very data-driven to defer to science rather than deny it. So, like, this isn't a site for you if you think the science is out. If you're not a scientist, perhaps you shouldn't disregard them like politicians have done. And so we're interested in driving a conversation forward to get to policy and get the politics out of it, right? Because it's important. It's one of the greatest mother of all risks. And oddly enough, not oddly, but it sort of makes perfect sense, investors are totally demanding that, companies grapple with a changing climate. Trump, the politician, disagrees with Trump, the investor, who's trying to put up a seawall around his Gulf property in Ireland because he totally thinks that the threat of rising sea levels is real. So we just, one of the, I think, the antidotes to, I don't know that we could ever live up to armies of bots that are feeding misinformation from the Chinese or the Russians or from ourselves. But part of the answer is this is, and if you fight free speech with more free speech and hopefully more accurate free speech. And so, we're going well past this. We're going to talk to, farmers in red states who are changing the way they do business and totally living a new life in, a new climate reality. There's plenty of that going on around the world, and we thought we would codify it and try to do a better job to admire a lot of the coverage that we have and sort of plant a flag, and say, we're not in the business of denying scientific data. We're in the business of trying to adapt to it.
Yeah, I'm not going to go egregious. I'm going to pick up on the climate angle for a second because I'm a hopeful man. So we had a workshop at the Institute a couple weeks ago where we had the head of NASA Goddard in conversation with the head of our environmental reporting section. And part of the day, so they were describing sort of the lay of the land and reporting on climate change and its difficulty. The second half of the day, we had 2 or 3 journalism students paired with a PhD student in climate science. And then we gave them a series of rounds of news stories and said, what's the climate angle? And these were like NASCAR stories, recipes, whatever, just with the idea that we could have an entire day of the New York Times where every single story had a climate dimension, right? And if we could collaborate with climate scientists on that level, right? And the pitches were amazing, right? So I feel like, again, by empowering journalists to be more facile with models, with computation, in this case, artifacts of climate science, you can sort of move a story along in a more compelling way. Sorry, I didn't get egregious. That would have.
My egregious example would just be the fact that so much messaging occurred on Facebook that was not collected or preserved or reviewed by the FEC in the 2016 election. I think that's a fascinating situation. Does anyone? Sorry, were you going to add something?
I would say, yeah.
Example you thought of yours.
Well, I mean, one thing, I haven't shared this publicly, I'm going to generalize it just a bit, but it was me watching it in real time from the other perspective of, I'm on the media side. I happened to be in Kentucky the night before the election, so Monday before the election. A funeral home, imagine me in a funeral home for an aunt, passed away. And I'm in that setting, I'm under strict instructions. It's the night before the election, not to bring up the election or politics, right? Not appropriate. Or the fact I'm from Washington, D.C., or that I work in the media. And I'm not going to... So I'm making small talk, and it's with somebody who I just met for the first time. It's a relative to be. And she pulls out her phone, breaking news, and says, wow, breaking news, the Pope just endorsed Donald Trump. And I looked kind of funny, and I thought I was very good in that. I didn't say, no way the Pope would endorse Donald Trump. I said, I'm surprised the Pope would endorse anyone, right? It's very... So anyway, I said, can I ask where you're reading that? And she said, well, all the media is reporting it. And I said, but seriously, what site is it on? She said ETF, which I'd never heard of, and it stood for End the Fed. And when I left that evening, I looked it up, and it literally had millions of likes, and it was moving the night before the election. And so I saw it in real time. It happened, and she very much, I'm sure, voted based on information that she's collected.
Just one egregious example. Okay, let's take another question from the floor. I've got Dick Reisman over here who has a question.
Well, a lot of the discussion here seems to focus on reputation in various aspects. So I'm sort of curious about opinions. It seems to me the Google's PageRank sort of was a way to get reputation to apply to search results. And if we can and they got more sophisticated, it's not just popularity, but which sites link to which sites. So the question is, can we do something like that of reputation of content sources? And also, who is providing that reputation and what's their reputation with a recursive kind of thing with a domain categorization? And, so one example is, maybe I like Noam Chomsky as a linguist, maybe I don't like him as a politician. So you could get sophisticated with different choices like that. And the question is, does that provide an avenue? And is anyone doing it? Who might do it?
Anybody? Mark?
I think this is yours. Oh gosh!
I guess the question not to, dumb it down, but is it? Are there just some simple technical fixes maybe on social platforms like Facebook that we should be making to clear up some of these issues? And is Facebook making any of them at the moment?
Right. So in the course again, we spent a fair bit of time looking at. Actually, we purchased 5,000 followers on Twitter to see what that might feel like. Try them on, see what kind of power we could exert with all 5,000, and couldn't exert very much power. And then had to think about what is that providing. And we look bigger now because we have these accounts following us, and I paid a little extra money, so they retweet when we tweet something, so that's exciting. But it didn't really go as far as we'd expected it to. Which is to say that the first order, very simple, how am I going to game a kind of trust system, isn't necessarily such a great way to go. I think we've seen, though, much more sophisticated and coordinated ways to try to engineer follower-friend relationships that give somebody a much broader or give an outlet a much broader reach and a much stronger appearance of trust. I think it's an interesting, in the same way that I'd suggested that perhaps there's a parsimony principle around data collection, there should be something around the ways in which trust is surfaced in these systems and then is in turn visible. I think the problem with Facebook is, with Twitter is not so much. I mean, it's partially the minions of automated bots. It's also the fact that people are able to coordinate and act through automation at a scale that I don't think the network thought about at first, and lots of things break down because of that. That doesn't answer your question.
But that word trust has been throughout this session. That's essentially been the core currency of this discussion.
Just a quick comment related to that. There's an interesting project Sandy Penfield is doing. He did a book called Trust: Data, and he's working with the World Economic Forum, and I think actually one of the countries in Europe is actually testing an interesting trust model for personal data. Mm-hmm. So it's worth looking at.
It's ultimately all this is based on, isn't it? Yes, sir.
Mr. Kent talked a little about the situation with the tweet from somebody who got something that the Pope had endorsed Mr. Trump, and that could have, from a purely factual perspective, it could have been much more likely, in fact, that the Pope would actually endorse Mr. Trump's opponent. Do you guys have anything to say about why? Maybe some people are, some audiences are more receptive to what we describe as fake news.
Well, certainly there's, I was reading through something probably 4 or 5 years ago now, there's research that's been done on trust in digital information and kind of the attributes of it. And it's really great research that's been done well before a lot of these current discussions. And the move towards the belief in your own belief system, confirming your own belief system, that's a builder of trust. Even if it's tainted information or biased information, it's trusted. Much the same as I talk about trust on the entertainment side of our membership. People trust HBO for great entertainment, and so they trust The Onion for humor, right, and parody. So that move towards that attribute and away from sourced and accurate information is happening. And I think, and one data point that I remember at the time that I thought was fascinating was Fox News was the most trusted TV brand from a percentage basis, and it also is the most distrusted, both. when you looked across the spectrum. And so they were nailing it, right, in terms of giving their audience what they want. That's a new dynamic for us in a fragmented digital world that I don't think is going to change.
Mark?
You're the expert.
But I think you can. I remember had a guest from Microsoft Research who had explained to me some work they were doing on Bing, and recognizing that certain search terms returned highly polarized content, that they could recognize that, and that when that happened, this notion of polarized meant that there were one or more poles, and so you could, searching 9/11 conspiracy or something gives you a set of links. The solution that, or an alternative that Bing was considering was to not just return results from one poll, and not to return from, mix in results from the other poll because it'll be too easy to fish them out, but to find these kind of bridge documents that live in between and serve those in addition to the single poll. And whatever you think of the idea and the feasibility, I thought it was interesting that the search engine took on some notion of social good in designing its operation. So it wasn't just about people clicking through, right? We are going to deliberately surface things that you might not click on, but that instead helps to promote a sort of a deeper conversation around a particular topic.
Last thought from Monica or Jared?
Sure. I mean, I think, part of it is humans were creatures of habit, and also the way we sort of consume things because of technology. And, think of, you go on Netflix and then you have recommended movies or shows based on things you watch, right? This is part of that question is, do we want to only get things recommended based on an algorithm, or maybe I would want to see something else in that feed, right? Something that's very different than what I would typically go for. But this is, I think, going back to what I said earlier about the consumers, and I don't want to sound like some anti-consumer. My entire job is to sort of think of consumers all day long. But part of it is how we consume things, I think, and what do we want, and it's up to us to go up to companies and make demands too, a little, I think.
I think we're going to end it there. I want to thank this panel. We only barely scratched the surface of this issue. There's everything's at play here: privacy, trust, government regulation, First Amendment, free speech. All of it's at play. You've heard today, I hope, some of the great commercial opportunity, great opportunity in the science and the technology of machine-driven media, and you've also heard some of these deep questions that these technologies are provoking. My hope is that New York is the place where maybe we'll solve some of these questions, because I think that there is the right mix here of concern about these issues, as well as the right both technological and kind of business acumen to answer some of these questions. So I too am secretly an optimist, despite my Black Mirror-oriented questions on this panel. I've promised Mark I'd let him out to go teach computational propaganda. And so we're going to end our panel there, and I'm going to invite all of you to drinks. I want to thank everyone at Bloomberg for hosting us. I want to thank the entire team at Bloomberg that helped us with this, everyone from Gideon Mann to Clay to Caleb to Mia to Tanaya, everybody on the Bloomberg live team that helped us put this on, everyone working the soundboard and the lights and in the back running the cameras, etc. Thank you so much. I also want to thank the Media Lab team, Amy Chin, Alexis Avedisian, Tricia Beckles, who've been here with us today. Thank you so much. Should we do this event again next year? Okay, then we will. Thank you very much. Have a drink.